Against all odds, here we are again, wrenching on this Honda CB550. In fact, it's so weird that it doesn't even feel right titling this video Episode 3. But the last few months that I spent with this vintage bike was rife with a few very apparent issues that definitely negatively affected the so-called quality of life aspects of using the bike. The brakes are not very good at all, the electronics are still quite finicky, the gas tank petcock leaks, I'm pretty sure it's running lean, it still leaks oil, the battery doesn't charge, and sometimes the clutch slips. And it all makes sense considering all I really did was get the bike running and then daily it. The bike is meant to be a fun and rebellious city slicker that spends all of its existence out there in the elements, and by the time I had moved out and let the bike fulfill its purpose, the winter came and I just started driving the car. So on the days, every now and then where I rode the bike, it wasn't really annoying enough to wrench on the bike in the cold and then fix these issues. Now it's getting warmer and my motivation grows. So what happens now? A budget build to turn this thing into a reliable daily, front end swap to address the brakes, M-unit rewired to scrap all of the old hacked up harness to start fresh and simple, cheap and easy restoration of the whole bike, and engine work to make sure this thing runs like it needs to. By no means do I consider my K100 a show bike, but this CB550 won't even be nearly as polished as that. This is going to be an incredibly budget and daily driver motivated build. I can't make this thing too nice, because where's the fun in that? So let's start with the front end swap. Naturally beginning with the theory of it all. I remember being told a long time ago that you can use conversion bearings for a cheap swap instead of changing the entire stem when going from CBR to CB. So I did some research to confirm or deny this claim, and what I found looked like confirmation on a forum. You could pause to read these Instagram screens if you like. Those who follow me there, you guys already seen this, but I gotta get everybody else up to speed. So order the top and bottom bearing sets. These are the part numbers. As you may recall from the last episode, one fork from that front end was very much tweaked, so I finally sourced a new one. Same with the wheel, but I wanted to spend less money because, remember, I might use a Cognito hub to run a stock size 19-inch spoke wheel or maybe even an 18-inch. My solution here was to check cross compatibilities between CBRs, so maybe I could get an older, cheaper wheel. So all of these parts started to come in a staggered fashion. But the next day the bearings came and it was 60 degrees, so it was definitely time to begin a fork swap. But first, we gotta visit an old familiar place. Definitely felt like a return to form, a revival of an old buddy, a return to humble beginnings, wrenching in my parents' backyard. Lower triple tree, bearings top and bottom, and I just tossed down the fork seals to show you that they also came. Bottom inner race as well as that rubber seal will have to be removed from the lower triple first and foremost, then replaced by this pack. You could tell it's the bottom one because it comes with spaces, the top doesn't. Therefore, all this other stuff can bloody get lost. It's time to fight with this thing. I've seen this done a few ways. A fancy puller tool made specifically for this. A press where you just force the stem down, which would push the race up. I've seen people cut it off with a small Dremel. And then there's the way I'm about to do it. Just heat it up and pick at it a little bit. It takes the longest, but I got time. We all do. I started by WD-40 in the area and then try my best to destroy that seal a little bit. Either get all the rubber off to avoid it catching fire or create a lip to get under the race a little bit easier. Heat makes metal expand, so you direct it at the inner race and just beat the shit out of it. I could have bolted down the vise, but The kit comes with sealed bearings, meaning the balls and the inner race, they're all contained. It comes with the outer race, 2 spaces, which we're going to use the larger one, the seal, and a sticker. I cleaned all the burn, the rubber, and the elbow grease from the triple, and I just set it aside. It's time to pack bearings, so make sure you grab way too many gloves and use them more liberally than San Francisco. You know how packing bearings goes. If you make a mess, and you absolutely hate it, you're doing it right. So keep it up. First thing that goes on the bottom is the spacer, assuming that you need one. In this case, remember, we need the larger of the two. Next up is the seal. Throw a little grease on that guy. Now the bearing itself. Now, if you thought the removal of the old race was barbaric with all that fire and hammers and picks, let me relieve you by showing you my super high-tech and fancy bearing installation tool. A broken, oversprayed, rusty old door stopper. Yeah. You may remember this guy from the K100 build where I used it for this specific job and, a couple other things. I was super happy to see it wasn't thrown away since I moved out. The alternative is buying a PVC pipe from Home Depot, whatever you want to do. You just need a tube of the correct size. You want to keep it lined up with the inner race to minimize any damage to the bearings, Don't use a tube that will force down on the outside part. Meaty swings with the rubber mallet and just let it seat into the seal below. No need to get goofy on it. Once we actually get to the frame, we could press any outer races, but those could just sit to the side for now. That's a done deal. Wait, one more step. I put the outer race with the triple, just so they could stay together, and I just threw it all in a safe place. That was the job, and it was done. But I was feeling good, wouldn't you know? So I started looking for something small to do with the rest of the daylight. And let me tell you, I was afraid of whatever might have been living under this table because nature certainly made a mess of it. Maybe not more than me though. I never actually cleaned this junk front end, so I just sprayed down one fork and the rotors a little bit. Then I took the rotors to my old bench grinder to get the surface rust off with the wire wheel. They looked pretty good by the time I was done, so I bagged them up and took them inside so they don't rust. And with that done, I called it a day. Now later on that week, the left fork came in and I was very happy with the condition and the cleanliness of it. Hell, it didn't even have any leaky fork seals, so that was pretty nice. As compared to the absolute mess of the other two. Yeah, you can see the topmost one is just bent to hell. So I made the decision to leave the new eBay fork alone. It's nice and it ain't leaking, but I'd simply just change the fork seals on the filthy junk fork, as well as, clean it up because Jesus. And clean it properly was the first thing I did so I could actually work on it inside because it wasn't particularly warm that day. This is Ginger's old cage that she uses when she feels like it. Fork seals are a really crappy job, and they're not my favorite. And since you're dealing with a long and tall object, it's kind of hard to film without a wider lens. And all I got is this kit lens with a tired autofocus, so let's get goofy. You know what's bad when you gotta consider using a Dutch angle? Using a fork compression stand, you could get access to to these nuts. If you don't compress the spring, you won't be able to get to it. That's what this tall tool here is for. On CBRs, you gotta get this bottom bolt out and pull out the what's it who's it to split the fork leg, followed by the dust cap and the seal lock ring. Then just hulk out the seal. Maybe now you see why I'm not a big fan of fork seal jobs, but it got worse. I realized that, well, the damage on the outer fork from whatever this bike had gotten into had dented the inner area right where the damn seal sits. So I tried to beat it back outwards, then I grabbed some hardware from the bent to hell fork outside, to donate it to this fork because things like the inner washer was slightly dented as well. If you look at the spacer, like the washer on the bottom, you can kind of see how the left one is sort of cookie shaped compared to the right one, which is perfectly round. The left was from the fork that I'm working on, and the right was from the actually from the bent to hell fork. Thinking maybe everything was good, I continued on with the job, sliding all the small bits down the fork tube. But then I started to realize when I was putting the fork seal into the seat that it was unusually hard to get it down there. Still, I managed to get everything back on to the point of, adding fork oil. But it was all in vain, unfortunately, because the damage to that one specific spot outside of the fork had meant that the seal could not properly seat into the fork because, in a rather comical display, oil had begun leaking around the outside of the seal. So not along the inside by the chrome that we're used to, but literally oil was getting around the outside of it because the metal area was cookie shaped. So it was a bust, unfortunately, so I just drained it fully and let it sit outside. I'm gonna have to buy a new fork leg. Next up was that Caliper Rebuild, which tends to be a pretty easy job. I started off by cleaning off everything with brake cleaner and dish soap. I got the first set of pistons out and started with the next set. The ideal way to do this is to use an air compressor and just pop them right out. The alternative is to use some channel locks with some softer material around the grips like tape or cloth. You want to go evenly around the pistons and make sure you stay as close to the top of the pistons as you can. It's definitely not the best way, but it does work, if you have enough pistons showing when you move the calipers at least. These pistons were pretty grimy from sitting in filth, so I had to clean them up. Each part of the piston has 2 seals, you just gotta pop those out too. On this particular model, the pistons are actually 2 different sizes for top and bottom, so you get a bunch of different seals with the Caliper Rebuild kit. You know which ones go where because one piston is bigger than the other, so it's obviously same goes for the seals. You just gotta lube them up with brake fluid and fill the pots too when you're putting the pistons in. For some reason, they give you 4 of the O-rings that are meant to seal each half of the caliper when you only need 2 of them. So I don't really know what that's about. Rinse, repeat everything, and the calipers were looking pretty damn good. I bought these neoprene gaiters for my forks called shock socks to protect the seals. I think I'm going to run them when the bike goes on the road and see what I think of them. But for now, I just had to wait for that CBR1000RR wheel to come in. The wheel was looking fine and it was holding air, so everything was looking good. I grabbed the junk rotor hardware and junk spacers, my junk axle, and the rotors themselves to dress the wheel. All of the CBR1000 hardware bolted up to the 929 wheel like expected. Finally, we can now actually visit the bike itself. I know what happens and I'm literally scripting this thing right now, and somehow I'm happy to see it. So let's run it a little bit off of what's left in the carburetor one last time before I strip it. Man, I can't wait to get rid of all this spaghetti crap when I rewire this thing. All the races gotta come out. Notice how the ball bearings are not sealed. This is that OEM style that tends to rust. I took some time to hit just a few bare metal spots with some black paint that I had laying around, just so they don't rust anymore. Since before I started wrenching that day, I left both bearing races in the freezer so they'd shrink down a little bit, making them easier to install. I just want to show you that real quick. Of course, anything metal on metal, you want to get some grease in there. Quickly did it while it was frozen, and it was just way too easy. As we know from that forum post, the top race sits slightly proud of the frame, and the bottom race sits recessed inside of it in this application. For the bottom, I got to the point where the race was flush, then I used the socket with the hammer to softly bring it all the way home. The top bearing pack just sits on the top, it doesn't get pressed anywhere. I started to install a junk hardware and was pleased to see that you can indeed use the original steer stops. Of course, this will have to be trimmed to offer maximum steering range, but luckily it's just a matter of shortening that frame tab right there. I actually grabbed that dented right fork that leaked out just to mock it up, while a good one was on the way. So there's no oil in the right fork here. By the time I was done roughly mocking it all up, the night had come around, so I called it a night before I could really install the clip-ons and the brakes. I had to call it a night, but I was definitely liking what I was seeing, so I had no issues. On the following morning, when the replacement right fork leg arrived, I swapped it out real quick, then I installed the old pads into the brakes. I just cleaned them up. I'll likely replace them later, but they're fine for now. Once everything was bolted up as it would be, I realized that the right rotor was actually bent, unfortunately. It's slightly warped. And that's kind of hard to show on camera, but A, I could see it now that everything's lined up and on. B, it's doing that thing where it pushes back against the piston at a certain point in the rotation, which gives you a dead lever. And C, there is some damage that you may have noticed on that particular rotor, so it definitely makes sense if it was bent. I was just hoping that it wasn't. No matter, I'll just swap it out and also change those wheel bearings while I'm at it. I just kind of crammed the headlight in there, just to get some hypothetical shots of the bike. It's not actually mounted on there. But tell me what you think. I think it looks better, mainly because of how rank the original front end was. It'll certainly stop better too. I got the clip-ons mocked up on there, but I don't really plan on keeping them long term. I sat on the bike and it feels more comfortable than I'd expect, likely because on this bike, the seat is still lower than the clip-ons, so your weight isn't really pitched forward onto them. I still want to get a spoke wheel up front, but I don't know. I don't want to think too far out ahead. Once I get the rotor and the wheel bearings, and I know the front end is solid, I may pull an engine next, but I'll ask, if this was your project, what would be your next step? Leave a comment below, and if you have any questions about what I plan to do with any one part of the bike, you can leave those in the comment too, because I'm sure there's some stuff I forgot to explain. In any case, hope you can dig where this is going, and I hope you enjoyed the video too. You just watched the illustrator, and I'll see you on the next one.